Jason X, The Experiment by Pat Cadigan. Chapter 2. There was one way, and only one way, to get past the fence onto the power station property. It sucked, and you had to be really fucking careful if you didn't want to get caught. But if you were a good swimmer, were tough enough to go naked in extremely cold water, towing a waterproof bag with your clothes, and didn't mind risking your nads in whatever the radiation level was, then all you had to do was take a dip in Veronica Lake. Of course, you couldn't just strip down and wade in. You had to strip down and cover yourself from head to foot with mud, and make sure you slipped in and out at a spot screened by as much overgrowth as possible. Although the groundskeepers didn't tend the area of the lake shore off the grounds, the security guards watched it pretty closely. There was a floating barrier, wired with an alarm that marked the boundary of the power plant property, but the motion sensor only went down 20 feet, so it wasn't all that hard to slip under. If you could withstand the cold without having a heart attack, that was. The power plant management was obviously counting on the cold more than just about anything else to discourage protesters from trespassing. That and the possibility of getting cooked by radiation. The plant trumpeted how low the radiation level was everywhere, but everybody in the movement knew that was pure grade Z bullshit. Or friggin' lies, to put it frankly. Well, nobody wanted to get radiated. On the other hand, nobody wanted to let them go and kill Earth-2 the same way they'd killed the old homeworld. But anyone serious about preventing Gaiacide would have been prepared to put everything on the line, especially their nads. It sucked, but somebody would have to make the sacrifice for the greater good. Sawyer Orestes, rhymes with testes, haha, had been the first to volunteer for a reconnaissance mission. No sabotage, no breaking and entering, just a stealthy little look around to get the lay of the land. He planned every step, went over it repeatedly, and then took the ice-cold plunge. He, like everyone else, had been fully expecting to get caught, and he, like everyone else, was shocked when he was not. Since the first foray into enemy territory, he had gone again half a dozen times, and he had started taking one or two other people with him on the last few trips. Sawyer Orestes, environmental activist, covert operations expert. It was sexy, which meant he was sexy. What wasn't sexy was the endless group discussions of how best to exploit this apparent chink in the power station armor. Some people felt it called for some kind of immediate, decisive action, although they differed on what this action should involve. A non-violent takeover and occupation of the plant as a demonstration of how vulnerable the place really was to terrorists. Or several hours of improvised guerrilla theater-style antics to make all those plant geeks and fascist guards look like fools. Or even explosives just to quit fucking around immediately. Others insisted they should continue to lay low and gather more intelligence. Look for some way to bug the place, and then record them making up lies and talking about how they were going to fool the public. Although, an even better way to do that would be to have one of them get a job at the plant, build up a good work record for a few months, and then start leaking information, like radioactive waste. A very few people argued that they should all pack it in immediately and go home because the plant was actually allowing them to sneak in, lulling them into a false sense of security just so they could monitor their activities. Then, before they could actually do anything constructive, the plant security would spring their trap. The next thing any of them knew, they'd be locked in a sub-basement where the waste was stored, withering away with radiation poisoning while the scientists observed from a lead-lined room, making notes on how long it would take for them to die. This particular faction didn't argue very much before packing it in and going home, but for some reason, that made no difference. The discussions were as endless as ever, even without them. Sawyer Orestes had been activating, as he put it, for more than a few years, and he was used to a certain amount of round and round. Lately, however, he found himself less able to tolerate the usual time-consuming arguments and the rhetoric that went with them. In fact, he was starting to think that the routine bickering accounted substantially for burnout among the veteran activists. Bad enough that they went on fighting the system and the status quo all the time and getting nowhere. Fighting each other and getting nowhere was so much worse. Follow that up with the usual walking around and around in a pocket line, chanting slogans, and pretty soon you would find yourself thinking you might as well be a hamster on a wheel, which was more or less what he had been thinking when the shiny red cruiser had pulled up at the front gate. They had been picketing for a little over an hour, leaving another 5 hours before the second shift came in to relieve them, assuming the entire second shift made it. Yesterday, 2 of them had been an hour late, while 3 more had failed to show up at all. It could be pretty tiresome. This morning's turnout had been decent enough that he had been giving serious consideration as to how he could get out of another long day's march to nowhere. Toothache, maybe? His wisdom teeth actually had started to erupt. Or queasy stomach might be better. Everyone else would probably be more sympathetic if he said he wanted to go get himself checked for radiation sickness. But then the car had appeared with the pretty young blonde woman behind the wheel, and all of a sudden he had felt a lot less bored. Pretty young blonde women in general had that effect on him. But this one in particular woke up something inside him because he recognized her. She worked part-time at the Ramsey County Weekly, one of those quaint hard copy things that published a combination of pre-chewed headline news and local features. He had seen her going in and out of the building only because his favorite cheap cafe happened to be right across the street. A couple of times she had even come into the cafe to pick up a sandwich or a carton of noodles. For my editor, as he had overheard her say many times. As soon as the car had driven through the gate, he had nudged Estelle and told her to run over and ask the guards who she was, just to see what they said. Estelle did so and came back to report that in a departure from her usual response of no comment or sorry, that's classified, Sophia had decided to actually inform her that the woman was an intern for some other unnamed government project for some kind of meeting. Sawyer had gleefully enlightened her and everyone else to the truth, but his glee was short-lived. The ensuing discussion, conducted as they continued to walk the standard picket line ellipse, did not quite descend into bickering, but it did make his eyes glaze over. Then inspiration struck. It was time for another covert expedition into enemy territory. With a reporter on the premises, even just a part-timer from a nothing printout like the RC Weekly, they were going to be busy trying to sell her a bill of goods. Maybe too busy to worry about possible trespassers. Another discussion ensued, but Sawyer was already too bored. He was going, he announced, and he was taking one other person along with him. Maybe they'd get close enough to the building to scope out possible points of entry for the future, or maybe they'd get even closer than that, like all the way inside this time. Or maybe they'd find the security so beefed up that they didn't even dare get out of the water. But at least they'd be doing something. Estelle and Mara had both immediately volunteered to come with him, which had both surprised and delighted him. He was not surprised that at least 2 of his fellow activists shared his boredom. He was simply delighted that they happened to be the 2 most attractive women in the group. He had managed to get all 3 of them mobilized before another discussion could break out. Estelle had actually made the trip with him before. Mara was the first-timer, virgin as she put it, with a deliberately provocative smile as she took off her clothes and handed them to him piece by piece. Estelle's smile had been amused and tolerant. Sawyer had decided to play it cool and made a point of keeping his gaze fixed firmly on each woman's face as he stashed their garments in the watertight pack with a thin, self-heating blanket and a few handy tools. As the strongest and most experienced swimmer, he would be carrying the burden of their clothing. "Now you have to promise me 3 things," he said as he tied the pack around his waist, making sure the weight was in front. It sagged a little, but not enough for even a minimal amount of modesty. Estelle's heard some of this before, but she'll bear with me, right? He grinned at her. "Pun intended," Estelle said to Mara, who nodded knowingly. "First, for as long as we're in the water, we swim single file, as close to each other as possible. Mara, you'll be between me and Estelle, which is the safest place for you, since you've never done this before. Secondly, you don't get out of the water any other place but where I tell you to, and not before I tell you to. And third, and most important," he paused, looking as solemn as he could, so they would both know this was serious. "This water is really, really cold, so please, I beg of you, do not laugh at me." By the time they neared an area of shore on the power station property, no one felt much like laughing. Mara had suggested earlier that their clothes, along with the thin thermal blanket, were an unnecessary burden. They should just take the tools, after all. They were sneaking in, which meant they didn't intend to be seen, so why bother with modesty? Sawyer had only chuckled without saying anything. No doubt she could answer that question for herself now. Once her teeth stopped chattering, anyways. They crawled up out of the water under the cover of a thickly overgrown bush that had no thorns but still managed to scratch the hell out of them. Shuddering violently, Mara began to tear some large leaves off a low-hanging bough to dry herself with, but Sawyer motioned for her to stop. He carefully pulled off a couple of the largest ones without shaking the branch or any of the surrounding greenery and gave them to her then. "Use as few as you can, and not all from the same place," he whispered with his lips against her ear. "The groundskeepers and guards don't come around here very often, so when they do, they shouldn't see anything that would make them decide otherwise." Mara was still shivering badly, so he wasn't sure if she actually nodded, but she did as she was told. They all dressed quickly. Before they were completely dry, they spent a long time squeezed tightly together with the blanket around them until the worst of the chills went away. Sawyer thought the recovery went much better with 3 of them. Or maybe it wasn't so much a question of how many as it was simply who. Sawyer found that when feeling finally returned to his body, it came on strong and hearty. He didn't actually want to be naked at the moment, but if he had been, it wouldn't have been a laughing matter this time. "Wait," Estelle said, speaking softly but urgently as Sawyer folded up the blanket. "I saw something kind of funny, I think." She jerked her curly blonde head toward the lake. "While we were under." Sawyer raised his eyebrows. "Oh?" "Care to describe it?" Mara asked, still rubbing her arms briskly. "I'm not sure how." Estelle made a pain-thinking hard face. "It was deeper down. I'm not sure how far. It was just a shadow, really. But I can almost see different..." She broke off again for a moment. "Different shades, I guess you could call it. And it was moving. Rising." They all turned to look at the surface of the lake, but there was nothing to see other than ripples spreading out from where insects or some small airborne seed or pollen had landed. "Maybe whatever it was changed its mind and went back down," Sawyer said after a bit. "It looked like a person," Estelle said seriously. "You know, how you would see someone who was coming out from somewhere below you?" Mara turned to Sawyer with an alarmed expression on her pinched face. "Oh, God! You don't think one of the others decided to come along at the last minute without saying anything?" Sawyer shook his head, frowning. "I'd expect one of their fascist guards before one of our people," he said, unsure whether he wanted to be right. "Oh, God!" Mara drew closer to him and Estelle. "You think we might be busted?" Estelle cleared her throat, still whispering. "Actually, those of us who share that particular characteristic prefer the term full-figured." Mara stared at her in disbelief. "Are you kidding me?" "I'm sorry. I do that when I'm scared." Estelle grimaced apologetically at Mara, and then at Sawyer, who was still staring at the water. "If you really did see a person," he said finally, "they should have come up by now. I think what it really was just some detritus we stirred up in passing. Or a mutant radioactive frog." "Ew!" Mara covered her lower abdomen protectively. "I hope this doesn't mean all my children will be 2-headed frogs." "Only the first 6 or 7, Estelle said. "After that, I'm sure they'll all be regular 1-headed frogs." "Okay, let's move," Sawyer whispered, herding them away from the lake. "There's a spot where we can get a great view of the power station without anyone seeing us. Come on." The demonstrators would have been more than tremendously dismayed to discover that their worst paranoid dreams were correct, and the security guards at the power station did in fact know of each and every incursion. Their surveillance system was both exceptional and thorough enough to keep them apprised of the movements of most creatures larger than a bird, including certain varieties of insects. However, they owed their comprehensive and well-detailed intelligence on the protesters' movements to a far less technological means. There was a mole in the group. When Mara had reported the first of Sawyer Orestes's cautious exploratory intrusions, the chief of security, a rather reserved older gentleman named Cosgrove, who was inclined to few words and many tattoos, surprised Dr. Olson by calling him to a secret emergency meeting. He wanted to discuss possible strategies instead of simply sending out a team to throw a net over the intruder. Cosgrove had retired after spending most of his adult life in one or another of the military's elite units. Which ones, no one knew for certain. with the possible exception of Dr. Olson, that was, since he had hired Cosgrove personally. But rumor had it that he didn't know any more about Cosgrove than anyone else did. Whatever else he may or may not have known about his hand-picked security chief, Timothy Olson knew enough to trust him completely. The only reason he actually went to the trouble of questioning the man about anything was for the sake of asserting his position as the boss in a visible fashion. Olson had a strong suspicion that, given Cosgrove's military background and experience, the overt display of authority was one of those protocols absolutely crucial in maintaining the man's respect and compliance. Even so, Dr. Olson found himself at a total loss the first time Cosgrove showed him the image of the trespasser on one of the screens in his office and said he wanted to talk about it. Simply bringing the guy in, sticking him in a cell, and interrogating him until he came apart probably would not tell them much. The rest of them would probably postpone any further actions indefinitely, and there they'd be, paying Mara a fat salary just to tread water with them for 6 months, possibly more, and not getting any smarter for it. Whereas, if they let the activists believe they could actually slip one by the big bad power station, they could watch them even more closely, put a few more eyes and ears in the area, tune them to an encrypted channel, and they would learn things even Mara couldn't. If they were planning to mount some kind of big sabotage operation, Cosgrove had said, then let them. He and his team would be able to watch every step and catch them in the act. Then they wouldn't have to settle for prosecuting 1 or 2 of them for mere trespassing. They could have the whole lot put away as terrorists, which was the sort of thing that tended to discourage other would-be activists from getting ideas. Hell, after that, it might be years before they saw another picket line, maybe even decades. And if they do something else instead, Olson had asked him, what then? Cosgrove had almost smiled. How the hell could we possibly know whatever they were doing isn't a serious attempt to sabotage the plant? Olson had given him carte blanche to deal with uninvited guests in whatever way he felt was best, with the proviso that no one else at the plant was to know about it outside of himself and the security staff. Cosgrove actually had smiled at that, albeit briefly. Since his retirement, he had missed covert ops. This wasn't actually very much in the way of a covert operation, of course, but Cosgrove didn't care. It was the spirit of the thing that mattered. It made the job that much more interesting. Privately, he thought it would possibly be some time before the activists got their shit together enough to organize anything even remotely resembling a guerrilla-style raid, at least from what Mara had been telling them. When they weren't picketing, they seemed to spend most of their time arguing. Whatever time they had left over that seemed to be devoted to screwing like jackrabbits. Or maybe that was just Mara. At the moment, Mara was crouching behind a tangle of undergrowth at the Stell, waiting for Sawyer to come back for them and regretting her impulse to go along on this expedition more than she had ever regretted anything in her life. No more than she had ever imagined regretting anything. Also, she was pretty sure more than she would ever regret anything else in the future. She had heard them talk about how cold the lake was, but she had in no way been prepared for the reality. What was really wild was that this was Sawyer's 7th goddamn trip. Sawyer Orestes rhymes with testes, ha-ha. The guy had never been a candidate for the Sane Man of the Year award. But geez, he had to be crazier than a friggin' sack full of monkey butts to keep doing this over and over. And what in God's name was going on with Estelle? She had always been low-key, demure even, to such an extent that Mara had been shocked when she had volunteered to go with Sawyer at all. And now here she was, doing it for the 2nd time. Even though she knew what to expect, how cold that freaking water was going to be. God damn, she had to be even crazier than Sawyer. Estelle had to have completely lost her mind, and if she had to back into that water one more time, Mara was certain she would lose her own as well. Since there was absolutely no other way of getting back on the other side of the fence, this was definitely a problem. Staying behind and insisting she could find her way back was out of the question. Sawyer and Estelle would never allow it. However, if she forced the issue by running away and reappearing safe and sound later on, they were all bound to take her for a mole. But holy mothering blue hell, the water was so fucking cold. The more she thought about it, the more certain she was that she simply could not bring herself to make the return trip. It was not just that the water was murky and actually kind of creepy. She thought she had seen something moving farther down in the depths on the way in, although she had dismissed it as nothing. Nor was she particularly taken by the idea that the lake probably was more radioactive than the power station claimed, and definitely more radioactive than it should have been. But most of all, she just could not get past the bone-crunching, flesh-numbing, brain-killing cold. And anyone who could was maybe not simply crazy, but fanatical crazy. Kamikaze and die for the cause crazy, which meant that at least 2 members of this group were seriously dangerous, and she had just made sure that she was completely alone and unmonitored in the woods with both of them. Several yards behind where she and Estelle were hiding, something stirred in the lake water near the shore. Mara glanced over her shoulder but could see nothing without standing up. All at once a twig snapped sharply somewhere much too close to where she was crouched. She looked up to see an enormous figure towering over her with a long metal blade in one hand. In that moment, everything else around her seemed to go black, so that she was looking through a long, dark tunnel at the length of sharp, shining metal in the figure's hand. Then the blade began to move, cutting through the very air itself as it descended toward her. Reflexively, she opened her mouth to scream, and felt something hard and brutal clamp itself over the lower part of her face, forcing the cry back down her throat so that she choked on it. Chapter 3. Lynn found herself wondering if she were actually going to get out of the power station alive. She had never heard of anyone dying of boredom in one of these places, but that meant nothing. It wasn't like these people weren't highly adept at covering things up. They did it all the time. Hell, they probably even covered up things that didn't need covering up, just for the practice. But you'd never know, because somebody else came along behind them and covered up the cover-up. Your tax dollars at work. Shifting position on the couch, she had to suppress a smile at the ancient joke while Timothy Olsen wittered on, believing she was nothing less than fascinated by how his education had inspired him to do something or other. Thank God for the high-capacity log, she thought, otherwise she might actually have had to pay attention to all this. The tiny little device on the coffee table had room for another 8 hours of Olsen's auto-hagiography before the batteries would quit, outliving her by a good 5 hours at least at that point, she thought. Of course, even if she did survive the interview with Olsen, she still had to live through the ride back to reception. Her heart might not be up to that much excitement after such a quiet interlude. She was never going to forgive Waxy Anschutz for this, she thought. Him and his pronouncements on what was news and what wasn't. If good news was no news, what was boring news exactly? She couldn't wait to get back and ask him that one. And while she was at it, she was also going to ask him what sort of master plan he'd had in mind when he had sent her out here essentially to be present for a public relations puff piece in real time. Yeah, that certainly was hardcore. No prisoners, old-school investigative journalism just like Mother used to make. Abruptly, she became aware that Dr. Olsen was looking at her expectantly and realized that he had just asked her a question. "I'm sorry," she said. "I got stuck thinking about something you said earlier. A lot of what you've been telling me about the science and technology involved here is really complicated if you're like me and don't actually understand why you can't just use a hammer and a chisel to split an atom." Olsen's expression turned slightly bewildered. "Ah, so does that mean you would consider taking a break for a while and joining me for lunch in the garden?" Lynn could feel her face redden as she laughed nervously. "Actually, I think it means I'd better." The garden Olsen had been referring to was on the roof. Lynn had never actually set foot in a real roof garden before. Of course, even rural, bucolic Ramsey County had its share of trendsetters with patios and decks and flat roofs covered with greenery. But none of them were a patch on this. It looked exactly the way she would have imagined it. A bit ethereal, like someone's idea of what every place in the universe would look like when the human race evolved to a higher level of consciousness, and didn't have to do anything except wander around discussing formerly incomprehensible philosophical concepts and smelling flowers. Or maybe even smelling philosophical concepts and discussing incomprehensible flowers. Who knew what kind of stuff might be possible? Even plain old LSD did a pretty good job in that department. Not that a straight arrow like Lynn would ever admit to having used a drug, or inhaling. Not inhaling drugs aside, she would have gone along with the flower smelling. Lynn thought, admiring the rows of flowering bushes on either side of her as Olsen led her to a round table in the shade of the largest umbrella she had ever seen. She hoped it was well anchored. All it would take was a sudden, hearty gust of wind and the whole thing would be airborne. Or perhaps there was nothing to worry about because Olson had worked out an arrangement with the wind as well, just like he had with Waxy, and God only knew who else. The food looked incredibly wonderful. Her stomach growled shamelessly as she let Olson put a chair out for her. Picnic stylings of the incredibly rich and powerful, how the elite dine al fresco. Lynn looked around for the impossibly young senior PR officer, but she had disappeared, without either explanation or farewell, replaced by an older woman wearing an outfit that her friend Jack would have called machine shop chic, in the nicest possible way. The sturdy brown verging on black fabric, the matte vinyl accents on collar and cuffs and pockets, the skinny belt and the discreet holster of tools fastened to it on her left should have looked foolishly affected, and perhaps on another person it would have. On this woman, however, it looked like becomingly natural. Her strongly oriental face was framed by a loose mass of rippled salt and pepper hair that felt almost to her waist and made Lynn wish she had let hers grow. "Dr. Ann S. Kai," said Dr. Olson, and Lynn was embarrassed to realize that she had been staring. "Lynn bows," she murmured, offering her hand. The woman's smile was unexpectedly sunny as she reached over from where she was sitting. "Enchanté," she said, the slightest hint of a laugh in her rich contralto. Dr. Kai is the head engineer overseeing the management and processing of the waste with the highest risk rating. Olson said this chattily, and realizing that this stunning woman was an engineer, Lynn was forced to reassess her harsh view of the profession. Dr. Olson turned toward a younger, dark-skinned man on her right. "And this is Dr. Theo Shabazz, who is a member of our Human Needs team." "Human Needs?" Lynn said, shaking hands with him. "Any needs in particular, or just whatever comes up?" Shabazz's smile was no less friendly for being as reserved as his suit and tie. "We look after the employees. This can be an extremely stressful place to work for any number of reasons." Lynn looked from Shabazz to Olson and back again. "So anyone having a bad day can just go to your office and unload, however they need to? Scream, yell, rant, rave, hold their breath till they turn blue, get drunk?" "Never a dull moment," Shabazz replied, utterly deadpan. Lynn turned to Olson again. "Damn, he's good. If I worked here, I'd be a lot more worried about how he does his job than how she does hers." She nodded at Kai sitting opposite. "No offense," she added with a look that included all three of them. "None taken." Shabazz's reserved smile was back. "Although there's very little chance that you would be working here any time in the foreseeable future." "Oh?" Lynn's eyebrow went up. "Dr. Shabazz's team vet every potential employee, without exception. Scientists, bottle washers, engineers, laundry staff, pipe fitters, bakery assistants." "Security guards?" Lynn put in. "Everyone," Olson said, nodding gravely. "Wow. And who vets them?" she asked. "I do." Olson's expression was unreadable. "With plenty of expert help from the government. Ultimately, it's the government I have to answer to for anything and everything that happens here. So I make sure I get as much help from them as possible. If I have to do all the answering, I won't be telling them anything that they don't already know." "And who vets the government?" thought Lynn. "Who watches the watchmen?" But she kept her thoughts to herself and sat back in her chair, shifting a little. "You're right," she said to Shabazz. "There's very little chance that I would ever work here." Pause. "But just out of curiosity, what made you say that?" The man's face was pointedly expressionless. "We're not hiring. No offense," he added politely. Lynn burst into hearty laughter in spite of herself. And on that note, Dr. Olson stood up and reached for the salad bowl in the middle of the table. "Let's eat." "You son of a bitch bastard!" Mara's body jerked convulsively as she fought without success to free herself. "You rat fuck pun scum asshole! You filled mutant abortion!" She was screaming at the top of her lungs as she struggled, but with Sawyer's big hand clamped firmly over her mouth, nothing came out but a lot of shrill, heavily muffled noises that bore no resemblance to words. Mara went on screaming, too hysterical to care about that or about the fact that with Sawyer straddling her arms as well as her torso, and Estelle's full weight on her legs, she could barely move no matter how hard she struggled. How long this went on before her energy finally gave out, she had no idea, but it seemed as if they had held her there for hours. And even after she went limp, That fuckhead Sawyer took his time climbing off her. That son of a bitch. It was just a goddamn good thing for him that she really was too wiped out to do anything, other than gasp for breath while she lay there, in the dirt, and the dead leaves, and the twigs, and the frickin' bugs, and Jesus, who knew what else? Rabbit afterbirth for all she knew. Otherwise, she would have torn Sawyer's stupid motherfucking head off and stuffed it so far up his old dirt road that it popped out his neck again, and then followed it up with that stupid machete. At least Estelle was smart enough to understand. If she goes for you after we get out of here, you're on your own, Mara heard her saying in an angry whisper. I only helped you with Mara just now so we wouldn't get caught. But if you'd done that to me instead of her, you'd already be fucking dead. I didn't do anything, Sawyer said, for what must have been the 6,000th time. I wasn't screwing around. I wasn't trying to be funny. I didn't sneak up on her. It's not my fault that she's so goddamn fucking jumpy. Mara rolled her head to one side and saw him sitting well out of her reach with his back against a tree, while Estelle sat cross-legged beside her. You, Sawyer said, using the machete to point at her, are never going on one of these with me again. Is that clear? Promise? She sneered. It's not funny, he snapped. Oh, good, said Estelle. I'm glad you finally understand that. Hey, I'm not kidding around. Sawyer got to his knees and continued to use the machete to point to each of them while he told them off. This isn't playtime in the playground. We are doing something very serious here. In case you haven't noticed, we're deliberately breaking the law, and if we're caught, we are seriously and deeply screwed. Jail could be the least of our problems. We don't know what those fascists could do to us before they bother to turn us over to the government. Which is why I don't want to be out here with anyone who's going to go bug house if something happens. I only want people who can ride out the rough parts and wait till later to shit themselves. Anyone here who understands a word I just said, feel free to toss a yes sir right back at me, or eat me, I don't care. Eat me, Mara croaked. Sawyer let his head drop back and closed his eyes with exasperation. Great. That's just great. Thanks, Mara. Hey, given a choice between yes sir and eat me, I'd say the same thing, Estelle told him. Who do you think you are with this yes sir shit, one of those fascist guards? And I thought you'd know better, Estelle, just because you'd done this before, Sawyer jeered. That'll teach me to underestimate the power of human stupidity. And I thought you were worried about getting caught, Estelle said. Talking pretty loud there, sir. Should I still bother to keep my voice down? Stop it, both of you, Mara said as she raised herself up on one elbow. She was still somewhat breathless, and she still felt like pounding Sawyer's obnoxious face against a tree trunk until there was nothing left but a grease spot. But she did her best to look and sound completely calm and reasonable. I'm sorry I shorted out on you guys like that. Sawyer's right. I could have fucked it all up. And not just for us three, but for everyone else, too. The government would be charging the whole group with conspiracy to commit sabotage, and God knows what else. She paused, trying to relieve her dry mouth by swallowing a few times. Anyways, I am sorry. Estelle reached over and gave her arm a sympathetic squeeze. Sawyer's expression softened slightly, but he didn't look completely convinced. Okay, you're sorry. What do you expect me to say to that? He asked after a moment. Estelle made an exasperated noise. Do you have to be such a prick? I don't expect you to say anything, Mara replied, taking over her, except maybe tell us what we're supposed to do now. Are we going to do whatever it is we came out here for, or are we just going to call it off and go back? Sawyer sat back against the tree and gazed down at the machete resting on his lap while he thought it over. I vote for going back, Estelle said suddenly, to both Mara's and Sawyer's surprise. You do? Mara whispered. Yeah, I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but I'm just really rattled now. I don't think I'm good for anything more today. Not high-pressure stuff like this. Mara nodded. The thing is, I'm definitely not ready to go back into that water yet. That too, said Estelle as they both looked at Sawyer. Just what did you have planned anyways? You didn't say before we left. Sawyer shrugged. Well, besides getting the two of you more familiar with the terrain, I was thinking about having a look at the fence. I think I might be able to work out a way to disarm it temporarily from this side, so we can get back without having to swim. Oh God, please, Mara said. Please do that. I take back every rotten thing I said. I am so sorry. If you fix it so I don't have to go back in that lake to get out of here, I'll be your slave forever. What an offer. Sawyer's face was unbearably smug. I'll do my best, but I can't promise. And even if I figure something out on the spot, I still can't promise I'll be able to do anything today. You could try, Estelle said reprovingly. I always do. It's just that I might not have the right equipment with me. Mara and Estelle looked at each other. Please tell me you brought something besides that oversized toad sticker, Mara begged. This isn't a toad sticker. It's a perfectly balanced cutting tool and a weapon. Sawyer held the machete up and showed them the handle. Plus, there are a half dozen separate tools in here, including a mini laser and a rechargeable energy source. He paused, suddenly looking a bit self-conscious. I lost the magnifier, and I can't do a whole lot of intricate close work till I replace it. I've got good close-up vision, Estelle said, brightening. We could try. You talking me through whatever needs to be done? He shook his head. I couldn't do that unless I knew exactly what kind of setup we'd be dealing with, which means I'd have to be able to see it for myself in the first place. No doubt it'll be some of the most advanced shit on the planet, way beyond stuff like color-coded circuits and just don't cut the red wire. Sawyer got to his feet. Okay, here's what I think we should do. I'll go look at the fence. Estelle, see how long it'll take you to go 50 yards west from here as fast as you can without making any noise and back again. Why 50 yards? She asked. Sawyer rolled his eyes. I don't know, it seemed like a substantial distance. You want to try 100? Go ahead, but it'll probably take too long. I just want to get some feel for how long we need to allow for any shit we want to do in the future. Estelle looked from him to Mara and back again, mystified. Okay, for example, he went on, impatience creeping into his voice. I already know that depending on the number of people I've got with me, the first leg of the trip in will take anywhere from 30 minutes to almost an hour. Counting from when everyone goes into the water to the moment when everyone's recovered enough so I can fold up the blanket and put it away. Timing, Estelle. If the group actually stops arguing long enough to plan some kind of action, we have to factor in how much time things take. We'd better know if we have to allow more than 4 seconds to go 50 yards. Estelle gave a single, breathy laugh. 4 seconds? What are you, a track star? Sawyer rolled his eyes, this time more dramatically. No, I thought maybe you were. He turned to Mara. How are you feeling now? I'm all right. Mara pushed herself to her feet and tried to brush off as much dirt and other debris as possible. You want me to go 50 yards south real fast? He shook his head. How's your visual memory? As good as anyone else's, I guess. Why? I want you to map out as much of this immediate area as possible, taking special note of anything that makes a good landmark. Memorize what it looks like and where it is relative to the lake. Mara wrinkled her nose. You should have told me. I'd have brought my camera. It's got enough capacity to chart everything in a 100-mile radius, which means it puts out enough power to show up at the power station security scans for electronic activity. And I assume it's got a locator chip in case it's lost or stolen, correct? There are ways you can block that, Mara said, unsure as to whether she were lying or not. You know any of those ways? She made a noise of disdain. Don't be ridiculous. If I knew shit like that, I'd be over in the power station making a fortune. Not out here with you guys making an ass of myself. No offense. She added quickly, Sorry, I'm just having a bad day. Now Sawyer and Estelle were trading looks with each other. But hey, I didn't say I wouldn't map, she said, doing her best to look agreeable. I'll do it. I'll map like mad. I'll get as many details as possible, and after we get back, I'll draw as much as I can. And next time, I'll bring something to sketch with. That shouldn't be any problem. As far as I know, they're still making wax crayons without locator chips, right? Fine, said Sawyer in a flat, unenthusiastic tone. Okay, check the time. His gaze fell on Mara's bare arms. Oh, shit. You don't have a watch. No, but I have a good sense for time passing, she said. He opened his mouth to argue with her, but Estelle put up a hand. Let it go for now, will you? Sawyer hesitated, then shrugged. You're right. Okay, look around, see where we are. We meet back here in an hour. He looked at Mara. Set your special time-passing sense so you'll be early, just to be on the safe side. Mara snapped to attention and saluted him. Eat me, sir. The same to you. He disappeared into the woods. She felt Estelle's hand squeeze her shoulder gently. Are you sure you're okay? Maybe you ought to go with me instead. I should probably be timing this for more than one person anyways. Mara gave Estelle's hand an answering squeeze. Nah, let's just do it his way this time. It'll be that much less for him to complain about later. The moment Estelle was out of sight and hearing, Mara sat down in the place where Sawyer had been and leaned back against the tree in an effort to make herself comfortable. She had no intention of marching around in the undergrowth playing 3D cartographer and keeping up the charade without an audience. If either of them came back early, she'd tell them she had eye strain from doing all that eidetic memorizing. Then later, when she made her report to Cosgrove, she could request a series of survey maps. That should do it. But if that wasn't good enough for a hand-drawn map, she'd just order up some custom zooms as needed. Of course, she'd have to make sure her sketches weren't too accurate. And now that she thought of it, she could add certain landmark-type things, which Cosgrove could have his men plant for use as reference points and markers. A wave of fatigue swept over her suddenly, and she let her head fall back against the tree and closed her eyes. 2 more weeks, she decided, taking a deep, weary breath and letting it out slowly. She was going to give this assignment 2 more weeks and not a moment longer. If something hadn't happened by then, she was taking herself off the case. She couldn't stand any more of these people and their bullshit. The lake, though, that had been her breaking point. That was it. She had been on more than a few operations in the past involving underwater work, one that had included some unexpected hand-to-hand combat. Her opponent had stabbed her in the thigh and sliced through her breathing tube. It hadn't been exactly a fun swim, but she had come out of the water in better shape after that than she had today. Maybe it wouldn't have been so bad if she had had anything to show for her trouble. But the whole ordeal had been for nothing. She had frozen her ass and probably radiated the hell out of it too, just so they could mess around in the woods. The hell with this. Someone else could play double agent eco-warrior for a while. She needed a break. All at once she became aware of the sound of someone moving through the woods, coming toward her from the direction in which Sawyer had gone earlier. Good God, she thought. Was Orestes rhymes with testes back already? Apparently his perfectly balanced weapon with the half-dozen miracle tools in the handle was no match for the power station's sophisticated defenses. Seized with a sudden, stubborn contrariness, she kept her eyes closed, listening to the intermittent soft snap of twigs and the rustle of leaves as he came closer. Even without a watch, I'm absolutely positive it hasn't been an hour yet, she said, smiling. He didn't answer as he came to a stop directly in front of her. Does that mean you got it all figured out already? She chuckled. Hope you remembered to cut the red wire. He still didn't say anything. Mara chuckled again. Don't tell me you're not speaking to me. She waited. Oh, right. If you really aren't speaking to me, you wouldn't tell me anything. Not even that. Nothing. Not even a long-suffering sigh. Maybe he was going to hold his breath until he turned blue while he was at it. You're mad because I'm not walking around imprinting the exact image of every bush and tree on my memory, she said. Actually, I did as much as I could. Then I felt like my brain was saturated. She paused again. Okay, since you seem to be done, why don't you give me a hand? Something suddenly plopped into her lap, making her jump. Surprise turned immediately to irritation. What the hell did he think he was playing at? She opened her eyes to see what Sawyer had thrown at her. At first, she thought it was a dead albino toad. Sawyer's way of getting back at her for calling his great big penis substitute a toad sticker. Then she blinked, and the blood-spattered object seemed to come into sharper focus. Now she saw that there were too many appendages and the shape was wrong. Then the limbs registered as fingers, only slightly curled and not obscuring the palm. Headline, heartline, lifeline. Without her willing it, her eyes tracked the curve of the lifeline down to what was left of the wrist. There was just enough to keep the watch in place. Sawyer's watch? She didn't have one with her, so he was loaning her his? She thought, dazed. Then, no, he's not giving me his watch, he's giving me a hand. Her gaze moved forward, going from her lap to the lower legs of the person standing in front of her. Weird boots, if they even were boots, made out of something that looked like rubbery mud shot through with veins of metal, all coated with the slime that seemed to be oozing out from inside the material itself. If they really were boots, they were all of a piece with the clothing. She could not see any seam or break as her gaze traveled steadily upward. Was that metal framework actually a kind of partial exoskeleton? Was it metal? It didn't look organic in the least, but it seemed to be sweating, or breathing, or like there was some kind of pulse in it. Her stomach began to execute a forward roll in slow motion. But Mara was only distantly aware of her own queasiness. She had no thought, no understanding, only the sight of something too malformed, too surreally grotesque and repellent to be called a face. It was something entirely different, ugliness without mercy, something formed from hate and murder, with a fury that was elemental. It had the inhuman quality of an insect, but it was not insect-like. It was monstrous and malign, a nightmare from some deep, dark place, untouched by the light of day. Brilliant, shining, savage eyes, the color of blood, stared back at her from the depths of two dark holes. He's wearing a mask. The thought blew through her mind briefly, no more than a scrap of paper caught in the wind. There was a bright flash of something, and very much against her will, her gaze shifted to the long metal blade, almost directly over her head. Covered with blood, the machete wasn't as shiny as it had been the last time she had seen it, in Sawyer's hands. Oh God, Sawyer's hand. For the first and last time in her life, her sense of duration, of time passing, failed her altogether. Later, she might have realized that there had been only a few scant seconds between the moment she had opened her eyes to see Sawyer's amputated hand in her lap, to when she had finally noticed the machete. But that would have been much later, and she was not going to live that long. Okay, this has been chapters 2 and 3 of Jason X, The Experiment by Pat Cadigan. I want to thank everybody for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with some more chapters. I hope everybody's enjoying it, and I really appreciate all the subscriptions. Please take the time to click that like button on these videos, drop some comments below, let me know what you think. Click the bell so you always know when the new chapters are coming, and spread the word. I mean, I know we're on Bloody Disgusting now and Reddit, but there's still more fans out there that I think would love to experience these books with us. As I told some of my original subscribers, most of these books I'm reading for the first time myself. And I'm really enjoying this experience of narrating these books for everybody. So until next time, have a great night, and thanks for listening.